The room sparkled with wealth. Crystal chandeliers hung overhead, catching the light as waiters glided past with silver trays of champagne. Laughter rolled across the marble floors of the Whitmore estate, bouncing between polished columns and portraits of ancestors who had never worked a day in their lives. It was a night meant for celebration, a fundraiser attended by the elite of the elite, a place where reputations were built, fortunes secured, and deals worth hundreds of millions whispered across linen-draped tables. In the center of it all sat two little girls, Amara and Amina, identical twins no older than 9, perched on the edge of velvet chairs their feet couldn't quite touch. They wore simple matching dresses, pale blue with delicate bows, chosen by their mother to honor the sweetness of childhood, rather than flaunt extravagance. Their hair was braided neatly, adorned with tiny white beads that clicked softly when they moved. They giggled at each other's secret jokes, unaware that the evening would turn against them in ways neither innocence nor money could shield. Across the table, the Whitmore children whispered. Their voices weren't low enough. "Look at their beads, it sounds like rattles." Another laughed so loudly a few heads turned. A cousin chimed in. "Do they even belong here?" It began as small comments, the kind meant to slip beneath notice. But the more they mocked, the bolder they grew. Their laughter, sharper than the clinking of glasses, cut into the air and into the silence around the twins. Amina stiffened. Her sister's hand found hers beneath the table, a quiet squeeze of comfort only twins could share. They had been taught to sit politely, to smile when greeted, to never make a scene. But there was no handbook for being mocked in a room full of adults pretending not to hear. Then came the moment no one could excuse as childish teasing. The Whitmore matriarch, hair silvered and piled high, leaned back in her chair with a smirk. "Oh, aren't they precious," she said, loud enough for the nearest tables to pause mid-bite. "Two little dolls, dressed up and brought in here like ornaments. How quaint." The laughter that followed was not the laughter of children. It was the laughter of power, careless, cruel, and dismissive. The twins froze. Their world, once filled with giggles and whispered secrets, shrank into a spotlight of ridicule. Adults chuckled. Some smiled uncomfortably, unwilling to challenge the social hierarchy that made mockery acceptable when it came from money. A few glanced away, ashamed to meet the girls' eyes, but none of them spoke up. For the twins, the room had changed. The chandelier's glow seemed harsher, the laughter heavier. They sat quietly, too young to craft a response, too innocent to understand why people who didn't know them could find joy in tearing them apart. Amara's eyes watered, and she blinked rapidly, determined not to cry in front of strangers. Amina clenched her little fists until the beads in her hair rattled faintly with her trembling. Yet while the room mocked, one figure remained still, their father. He had not interrupted. He had not snapped in anger. He sat in silence, watching every sneer, every chuckle, every dismissive glance. Behind his eyes, something shifted, though no one at the table cared enough to notice. They saw only a man letting his daughters endure humiliation, not realizing he was memorizing each face, each insult, each careless laugh. Because this man was not simply another guest at the Whitmore's table. He was the man whose signature held the fate of their empire. If stories like this matter to you, don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you never miss one. And drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. I'd love to know. Now, let's continue. The Whitmores had mocked two little girls without hesitation, but they had overlooked the one truth no amount of arrogance could erase. The girls were daughters of the very man their family needed most. And when he finally stood, placing a protective hand on each twin's shoulder, the hall grew quiet. His expression did not match the fury expected of a father. No shouting, no spectacle. Just calm, measured silence. A silence that unsettled more than anger ever could. Those who laughed leaned back in their chairs, suddenly uneasy. Conversations faltered, forks hesitated halfway to mouths. They didn't yet understand, but they sensed something had shifted. Something irreversible. The Whitmores had thought the evening belonged to them. They had thought mocking children was consequence-free entertainment. They had thought their wealth made them untouchable. They were wrong. Because the man guiding his daughters out of that glittering hall carried more than dignity. He carried the power to decide the fate of a $500 million deal, and by morning, the Whitmores would learn just how costly their laughter had been. And this is where everything began to collapse. Marcus Thompson was not born into rooms like the one he had just walked out of. He was born into a world where nothing was handed down but resilience. His earliest memories weren't of marble floors or silk curtains, but of a mother working 2 jobs to keep the lights on, and a father who reminded him daily that books were the only keys powerful enough to unlock doors that seemed sealed shut. From that foundation, Marcus built himself brick by brick. By 35, he had already transformed a struggling tech startup into a global powerhouse. At 40, he became one of the youngest black billionaires in America. By 42, his name was spoken in the same breath as titans of finance and technology, not because he inherited a fortune, but because he created one. Every success came with sacrifice. Every boardroom victory hard-fought against an unspoken question that followed him everywhere. Does he really belong here? If there was one thing Marcus never lost sight of, it was that wealth was not the measure of a man. Legacy was. That belief shaped not only the empire he built, but also the family he cherished. His wife, Naomi, had stood beside him since the days when CEO was just a dream scribbled on paper. She was not just a partner in marriage, but a strategist in life, grounding him when ambition threatened to consume him. Together, they had built something even greater than companies or contracts. They had built a home. And at the heart of that home were their daughters, Amara and Amina Thompson, identical twins whose presence could light up even the darkest room. At 9 years old, they carried an energy that was magnetic. Amara, the slightly older by minutes, was the bold one. Quick to speak, quick to laugh, and always ready to stand at her father's side as if she were already preparing to inherit his mantle. Amina was quieter, but her eyes held a depth beyond her years, observing everything, weighing every word before she chose her own. Both girls wore their hair in neat, beautiful braids adorned with white beads that clinked softly as they moved. Their mother often said their hair was a crown, one the world would try to make them lower, but one they must never set aside. They had already heard whispers in schools, already faced comments from children who parroted what they heard at home. Why does your hair make noise? Why doesn't it look like ours? At their age, such questions could wound. But Naomi had taught them the answer. Because we are who we are, and we are proud of it. Playful and bright, the twins lived between 2 worlds. At home, they were just children, building forts from sofa cushions and reading stories before bed. Outside, they were the daughters of Marcus Thompson, often seen but not always understood. They were learning too soon that privilege does not protect against prejudice. That being born into wealth doesn't erase the lines others will still try to draw. It was for them, for their future, that Marcus accepted the Whitmore's invitation. The Whitmore family represented old wealth, the kind passed through generations with surnames engraved on university halls and hospitals. Their foundation was crumbling, though, and Marcus had been courted as the key investor to secure a monumental expansion. The partnership, valued at nearly $500 million, would have positioned Marcus not only as a benefactor, but as a gatekeeper of influence within an exclusive circle that had always been reluctant to open its doors to men like him. On paper, the fundraiser was about philanthropy. In reality, it was about money and legacy. If Marcus signed on, the Whitmore's project would flourish, and their family name would shine brighter than ever. If he walked away, the cracks already forming beneath their empire would widen until collapse was inevitable. Marcus knew this when he and Naomi dressed for the evening. He chose a simple black tuxedo, understated yet flawless, his confidence carried in posture rather than jewels. Naomi wore a midnight blue gown, elegant without pretense, her presence commanding respect before she even spoke. The twins wore their matching dresses, pale blue, bows at the waist, hair neatly braided. They looked every bit the children they were, not props for a stage, not symbols of power, but simply 2 little girls excited to spend a special night with their parents. Walking into the Whitmore estate, Marcus had hoped for civility, even if not warmth. He had hoped his daughters would be treated as the treasures they were, not as targets for scorn. And yet, by the time the twins sat frozen under the weight of laughter, he knew the hope had been misplaced. For Marcus, the fundraiser was no longer about numbers, contracts, or deals. It was about dignity. And when dignity was threatened, especially that of his daughters, Marcus Thompson was not a man who hesitated. He didn't raise his voice in that glittering hall. He didn't need to. The silence with which he stood told everyone present that something had shifted. What none of them realized yet was that this man, the one they mocked by mocking his children, would leave that estate not as a guest, but as the author of their undoing. The Whitmore estate stood as a monument to inherited wealth. Acres of manicured lawns stretched out in every direction, dotted with fountains carved centuries ago in Italy and shipped over as though shipping costs were a trivial detail. The house itself wasn't just large, it was imposing, built of white stone and crowned with spires that seemed designed to remind visitors of their own smallness. To walk into it was to step into a world that had been engineered, generation after generation, to protect its exclusivity. The Whitmores were proud of that exclusivity. Their name carried weight not because of innovation or sacrifice, but because it had been etched into the fabric of old money society for over 100 years. They funded universities and art galleries, always with plaques bearing their surname. They held seats on boards where they contributed little but expected much. And at every turn they reminded those around them, directly or indirectly, that entry into their circle was a privilege, not a right. When guests arrived that night, the air hummed with wealth. Valets rushed to open doors of imported cars while a string quartet played at the entrance, their classical notes echoing across marble steps. Inside, the chandeliers glowed like fire trapped in crystal, and the long dining tables glittered with silver cutlery and stemware polished until it gleamed. On the surface, it was civility perfected. Beneath it, prejudice whispered like a draft through the hallways. The Whitmore children were the first to notice Amara and Amina. Young, privileged, and unchecked by discipline, they whispered loudly enough for nearby guests to catch their words. "Look at their hair," one boy said with a laugh. "It must take hours. Imagine keeping it neat." His sister added, "Why do they wear beads? It's so noisy." The comments carried a mockery disguised as curiosity, the kind children repeated from what they heard at home. None of the adults corrected them. A few chuckled softly, as if cruelty was just innocent chatter. Relatives joined in. An aunt leaned closer to another woman and said, "At least they tried to look the part." Her companion smiled knowingly, scanning the twins' dresses, which were simple but elegant, chosen for love rather than ostentation. Another cousin, just entering his teens, smirked and asked, "Are they here for the entertainment?" His tone made it clear he didn't mean music or dancing. Naomi heard every word. She squeezed Marcus's hand beneath the table, but her eyes never left her daughter's. She had endured these moments before. Sideways glances, thinly veiled comments about her presence in circles where few women of color were welcomed. But hearing it directed at her daughters cut deeper. Amara fidgeted, the beads in her braids clicking faintly, a sound now laced with shame because of how it had been mocked. Amina sat straighter, her small chin raised in silent defiance. Though her eyes betrayed confusion, she was too young to name. The Whitmores themselves, Patriarch Richard, Matriarch Evelyn, and their extended family, floated among the guests like royalty. Their smiles were polished, their words rehearsed, their laughter calculated to fill the space. To the casual eye, they were gracious hosts. To anyone who listened closer, their civility was paper-thin. They greeted Marcus and Naomi with an air of forced politeness, the kind that acknowledges presence but withholds acceptance. "Marcus," Richard Whitmore said, clasping his hand too firmly as though testing him. "So glad you could join us. It means a lot." His smile didn't touch his eyes. Evelyn, resplendent in diamonds heavy enough to drag at her ears, glanced at Naomi's dress before offering a clipped compliment. "Lovely gown. Quite understated." The words carried praise on the surface, condescension beneath. Every detail of the night underscored the same message. You are here, but you are not one of us. The quartet's music soared, elegant and detached. The chandeliers rained light across the guests, highlighting jewels, gowns, and tailored suits, as if the entire room were staged to magnify differences. Conversations around the table floated between vacation homes, art auctions, and family lineage, all topics meant to remind others of how deeply the Whitmores' roots were entwined with privilege. Still, Marcus remained composed. He had been in enough boardrooms to recognize the performance. He knew the game they were playing, though he was not interested in playing it. For him, this evening was meant to be a formality before finalizing the $500 million partnership. He had hoped to shield his daughters from the weight of subtle cruelty. Instead, they had become its direct target. The Whitmores, secure in their arrogance, didn't care to hide it. They believed their name, their house, and their history gave them license to sneer without consequence. What they overlooked, what they would regret, was that the man they underestimated wasn't simply a guest. He was the keystone of their future. And while they whispered about beads and braids, mocking what they didn't understand, Marcus was already calculating the true cost of their laughter. Dinner at the Whitmore estate was designed to impress. The long banquet tables stretched almost the length of the ballroom, draped in white linen so thick it fell like velvet to the floor. Crystal glasses sparkled in rows, reflecting the golden glow of chandeliers overhead. Silverware gleamed at every place setting, aligned so precisely it gave the illusion of perfection. Servants moved soundlessly, refilling glasses, placing dishes, sweeping crumbs as though erasing any sign of imperfection. The first course had barely arrived before the tension returned. Marcus sat with Naomi to his right and the twins across from them, their little feet swinging beneath their chairs. They had been coached to use their forks properly, to keep their napkins folded neatly on their laps, to smile politely if spoken to. Their innocence radiated in the midst of this cold formality, their bright eyes darting between the adults' conversations about stocks and art auctions. It didn't take long for the whispers to grow bolder. One Whitmore child, a boy with slicked-back hair and a jacket too small for his pride, pointed openly at the twins' braids. "Do you think they knock into each other when they walk?" He laughed, loud enough for several guests to turn their heads. His cousin smirked, tugging at his own smooth hair as if to contrast it. "It looks like it would take forever to fix that. Who even has time for hair like that?" The laughter that followed was not confined to children. Some of the adults chuckled quietly, choosing complicity over courage. Amara shifted in her seat, her small fingers tightening around the handle of her fork until her knuckles whitened. Amina lowered her gaze to her plate, shoulders hunched as if trying to shrink beneath the weight of eyes that had suddenly become mirrors of ridicule. Naomi's lips pressed into a firm line. Her instinct was to gather her daughters and leave, but she caught Marcus's calm expression and understood his unspoken message. Let them finish. Let them show who they are. He had learned long ago that silence sometimes revealed more than words. The main course was served. Roasted lamb, artfully plated with vegetables carved into delicate shapes. While waiters poured rich red wine into crystal glasses, the Whitmore children pressed further. "Why are they wearing the same dress?" one girl asked, her voice dripping with disdain rather than curiosity. "Didn't their parents have money to buy two different ones?" A cousin, emboldened by the laughter around him, leaned forward. "Maybe they're like matching dolls. You know, brought here just to look pretty for the night." Amara's hand slipped from her fork to her sister's beneath the table. She squeezed tightly, her face stiff with the effort not to cry. Amina's lip trembled, her eyes fixed firmly on her lap as if the plate before her no longer existed. The beads in her braids clicked softly with a shake of her head. And then, as if cruelty needed permission from authority, Evelyn Whitmore, the matriarch, gave it. She leaned back in her chair, diamonds glinting against her pale skin, and tilted her chin toward the twins. Her smile was thin, sharp, and deliberate. "Oh, aren't they precious?" she said, her voice carrying over the table with ease. Two little ornaments, dressed alike, brought in here so their parents could feel like they fit. The words hit harder than any childish taunt. They weren't careless, they were calculated. A joke disguised as a compliment, framed to sting, framed to remind everyone listening of the invisible line between us and them. The table erupted in laughter. Some guests laughed loudly, eager to signal their allegiance. Others chuckled softly, too cowardly to stand apart. Forks clinked against plates, wine glasses tilted, and the sound of ridicule swelled until it drowned the clinking of beads in the girls' braids. Marcus did not move. His posture remained tall, his face unreadable, but his hand closed gently over Naomi's beneath the table. She, too, remained still, though her jaw tightened until her teeth ached. They had weathered insults before, but hearing them directed at their daughters in front of so many in such a place of opulence sliced deeper than either had expected. For Amara and Amina, the room blurred. Amara's small fingers dug into the palm of her hand, nails pressing crescents into her skin as she fought the tears burning behind her eyes. She refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing her cry. Beside her, Amina shrank into herself, her fork untouched, her appetite erased by shame she didn't know how to name. At 9 years old, both girls were learning the cruelty of prejudice in its rawest form, the laughter of the powerful at the expense of the innocent. Not every guest joined in. A few shifted uncomfortably in their seats, lowering their eyes as though guilt could excuse silence. A woman across the table cleared her throat as if to object, but stopped herself when Evelyn's gaze slid her way. No one spoke in defense of the twins. Their silence became its own verdict. The music from the quartet in the corner carried on, unbroken and indifferent. Notes of classical harmony filled the hall, a backdrop of refinement meant to disguise the ugliness at the table. The chandeliers glowed just as brightly, casting a golden sheen across the polished silver and glass. But no amount of elegance could cover the truth of what had happened. Two children had been humiliated for the amusement of those who believed their wealth gave them permission to do so. In that moment, the divide was no longer hidden. It wasn't about money or deals or philanthropy. It was about power and who the Whitmores believed deserved dignity and who did not. The message was clear. Amara and Amina were not seen as equals. They were not seen as children deserving of kindness. They were spectacles, ornaments, dolls. Marcus's eyes swept across the table, memorizing every face, every smile, every smirk. His daughters would not remember all of them, but he would. They thought they had embarrassed him, diminished him by mocking what he valued most. They thought their laughter would fade into the air like smoke. But he knew better. He knew laughter can cost. And he was already calculating just how much this one would. At that table, with wine glasses still raised and laughter still spilling, no one realized the weight of the silence at the end of the long polished wood. No one realized they had crossed a line that could never be erased. And no one realized that the man they had dismissed, the father of the two girls they had mocked, held their future in his hands. For a long moment, Marcus did not move. The laughter still rippled across the table, rising and falling like waves crashing against stone. Amara's small hand trembled in his. Amina's eyes were fixed on her untouched plate. Naomi's lips pressed tight, her knuckles white as she gripped her napkin. Then, without a word, Marcus stood. His chair slid back against the polished floor, the sound sharp enough to pierce through the laughter. Conversations faltered. A fork clinked against a plate. One by one, heads turned. Marcus leaned down, resting a steady hand on Amara's shoulder and then Amina's. Both girls looked up at him, their wide eyes searching his face for direction. He gave them none. Not yet. Instead, he nodded once to Naomi. She rose with quiet grace, smoothing her gown as though it were simply time to leave. The family moved together, a unit of calm in a room that had just revealed its cruelty. There was no outburst, no words of anger, no demand for apology. Only silence. Deliberate and heavy, carried like a shield. That silence unsettled more than fury ever could. Guests shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to pretend nothing had happened or to acknowledge what they had witnessed. Some looked down at their plates, ashamed but unwilling to risk their place at the Whitmores' table. Others leaned back with smirks, dismissing the family's departure as an overreaction. "Too sensitive," a man muttered under his breath, his words just loud enough to be heard by the nearest guests. His companion laughed softly in agreement. Evelyn Whitmore herself tilted her head with a mocking smile, her diamond earrings catching the light. If they can't handle a little joke, perhaps they don't belong in these circles after all. Her voice carried, slicing through the hall like the ring of glass against crystal. A few chuckles followed. Hesitant, unsure whether it was still safe to laugh. Amara felt her cheeks burn. Amina clutched the edge of her chair until her father's hand drew her gently to her feet. Naomi walked close, her arm firm around both daughters, her head held high. The room parted only slightly as they made their way toward the exit. Some guests shifted their chairs with reluctance, unwilling to fully clear a path. Others watched with eyes that held both pity and relief. Pity for the humiliation, relief that it wasn't theirs to endure. Marcus said nothing. His silence echoed louder than words could have. He did not look back at the table, did not grant them the satisfaction of seeing his expression. He guided his family past the glittering chandeliers, past the string quartet still playing as if nothing had happened, past the walls lined with portraits of men who had inherited power and used it to exclude. The double doors at the far end of the hall loomed like an escape. As they approached, whispers rose behind them. They shouldn't have brought the girls. This is business, not a daycare. No sense of humor, that one. Each comment was a dagger flung carelessly in their direction, but none pierced the wall of silence that Marcus carried with him. At the threshold, Naomi glanced once over her shoulder. Her eyes swept across the rows of faces, some smug, some uneasy, some deliberately blank. She held their gaze for only a second, but the message was clear. We saw you. We will not forget." When the doors closed behind them, the laughter resumed. Not as loud, not as confident, but enough to signal that the Whitmores believed they had won. They believed the family had been shamed into retreat. They believed the night would continue, the wine would flow, and the deal would remain theirs. What they didn't understand, what not a single guest in that hall grasped, was that Marcus Thompson's silence was not surrender. It was judgment. And the price of that judgment would not be measured in bruised pride, but in billions. The car ride home was wrapped in silence. Amara and Amina leaned against their mother, eyes heavy but restless, the sting of laughter still fresh in their minds. Naomi stroked their braids, whispering soft reassurances, but her own chest burned with an anger she kept locked tight. Marcus drove without speaking, his jaw set, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. The Whitmores had laughed, believing the night ended in their favor. They had no idea that the true night was only beginning. By the time the Thompsons reached their home, a sleek, modern mansion filled not with relics of the past, but with the warmth of family photographs and children's drawings taped proudly to walls, Marcus's decision was made. He kissed his daughters goodnight, smoothing their blankets, whispering to them words meant to replace humiliation with pride. "You are my strength. You are my future. Never forget that." When the twins' door clicked shut, Marcus turned and walked to his study. The room was a contrast to the Whitmores' ballroom. No chandeliers, no oil portraits, only shelves of books, a simple oak desk, and the glow of a single lamp. Naomi followed quietly, closing the door behind her. "They laughed at our girls," she said, her voice steady but laced with fury. Marcus nodded once, his face unreadable. He reached for his phone, scrolling through his contacts until he found the number he wanted. Naomi watched him, her chest tightening. She knew that look. It was the same look he had worn years ago, when a board of directors doubted his worth and he answered not with words, but with results that left them begging for his leadership. The line clicked. "Reynolds," Marcus said, his voice low, calm, and absolute. "Withdraw. Every cent." There was silence on the other end, then the muffled sound of a man clearing his throat. "Sir, all of it?" "All of it." Marcus leaned back in his chair, his hand tightening around the phone. "I don't care if it takes the night. I don't care how many contracts need rewriting. The Whitmore expansion dies tonight. I want the paperwork in motion before dawn." Naomi exhaled slowly, the fire in her chest softening into something else. Pride. "Yes, sir," Reynolds replied. "I'll loop in the team immediately." Marcus ended the call, his expression still unreadable. But in his silence, there was no defeat, only power. Within the hour, emails began firing across the globe. Conference calls linked lawyers in New York, bankers in London, advisors in Dubai. Contracts that had taken months to draft were suddenly being torn apart, line by line. The Whitmores had assumed Marcus's signature was inevitable, that his presence at their fundraiser was the final bow on a neatly wrapped deal. What they had forgotten was that in a partnership, respect was just as valuable as money. And without it, there was nothing left to negotiate. At the Whitmore estate, the ballroom lights dimmed and the last of the guests trickled out, still oblivious. Evelyn Whitmore toasted her family with the confidence of someone who believed she had secured her legacy. Richard leaned back in his chair, already imagining headlines celebrating their expansion. Neither of them knew that at that very moment, bankers were shredding agreements and investors were pulling out under Marcus Thompson's quiet instruction. In his study, Marcus fielded calls one after another. "Yes, liquidate the position." "No, I don't care about penalties. Do it." "Yes, notify our partners. They'll understand." His voice never rose, never cracked. To anyone listening, he might have sounded detached, but every clipped word carried the weight of a father's resolve. Naomi sat across from him, watching. "You're ending $500 million tonight," she said softly. Marcus finally looked at her. "They mocked our daughters in front of the world. Money doesn't buy silence, not anymore." The words settled in the room, heavier than stone. By midnight, the machinery of Marcus's empire was in motion. Advisors drafted statements, investors rerouted funds, and legal teams combed through clauses to sever ties as cleanly as possible. The Whitmore's $500 million expansion, once a roaring engine of confidence, was now sputtering without fuel. For Marcus, it was not about revenge. It was about principle. The Whitmores had believed that dignity was negotiable, that they could belittle two little girls and still expect loyalty. They had mistaken wealth for invincibility. Marcus would show them the difference. As dawn approached, he stood by the window of his study, the city lights blinking against the horizon. Naomi joined him, slipping her hand into his. For the first time that night, he allowed himself a small breath of relief. "Our girls will never forget what happened tonight," she said. "They won't need to," Marcus replied. "Because the world will remember what comes next." The first tremor hit before breakfast. By the time the Whitmores were finishing their morning coffee, their phones buzzed with urgent messages. A partner in Zurich had pulled out. A hedge fund in New York froze its contribution. An influential bank in London suddenly requested clarification on financial guarantees. One by one, the threads holding their grand expansion together began to snap. Richard Whitmore scrolled furiously through his phone, his brow furrowed as he read email after email. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered, though deep down he knew. He had seen Marcus leave the table in silence. He had underestimated what silence could mean. By mid-morning, the headlines began to appear. Thompson Holdings exits Whitmore deal. $500 million expansion in jeopardy after key investor withdrawal. News outlets picked up the story with lightning speed, analysts dissecting every angle on live television. On trading floors, whispers grew into panic. Without Marcus Thompson's backing, the expansion looked less like a historic leap and more like a reckless gamble. The Whitmores called an emergency meeting. Family members crowded into their mahogany-paneled conference room, portraits of ancestors staring down at them as if mocking their loss. Evelyn paced the length of the room, her diamond earrings swinging sharply. "He's overreacting," she snapped. It was nothing more than a light-hearted comment. "A light-hearted comment that cost us the only investor who mattered," one cousin replied bitterly. "You mocked his children in front of half the city's elite. What did you think would happen?" Evelyn's eyes narrowed, but she didn't answer. For the first time in years, no one at the table laughed with her. Marcus, meanwhile, remained composed. He didn't call press conferences, didn't grant interviews. His only statement came through a single sentence released by his office. "Thompson Holdings has chosen not to proceed with the Whitmore expansion." No elaboration, no anger, just fact. The simplicity of it carried more weight than any outburst could have. But the market did not stay simple. With Marcus's exit, the dominoes fell swiftly. Secondary investors withdrew to protect their reputations. Suppliers demanded advance payments before delivering goods. Lenders, once eager to fund the project, suddenly doubled interest rates or pulled back entirely. What had looked like inevitability only days before now collapsed into chaos. By afternoon, financial networks ran segments dissecting the fallout. A suited anchor leaned toward the camera and said, "The Whitmore family may have underestimated the cost of arrogance." When your largest backer pulls out overnight, the question isn't if your deal collapses, but how quickly. Clips replayed across social media. Hashtags emerged, tying Marcus's withdrawal to dignity, respect, and the question of how racism operates in boardrooms as well as ballrooms. People who had attended the fundraiser began whispering to reporters, confirming that the twins had been mocked, that Evelyn Whitmore herself had delivered the cruelest line. The story spread, reshaped by public outrage until it was no longer about business alone, it was about values. Evelyn tried to control the narrative. She gave a statement to the press, brushing off the remarks as misunderstood humor. The attempt only fueled the fire. Commentators ridiculed her tone deafness, parents flooded forums with stories of their children facing similar insults, and advocacy groups amplified the call for accountability. At their estate, the Whitmores watched their empire unravel in real time. Contracts dissolved, shareholders demanded explanations, and the family name, once synonymous with stability, became a cautionary tale. Richard slammed his fist against the conference table. "All because of one man," he growled. But the truth was clearer. It wasn't just one man. It was one family they had chosen to humiliate, believing their wealth gave them immunity. They had mocked two little girls and dismissed their father's silence as weakness. Now that silence was echoing through global markets, dismantling what arrogance had built. Marcus didn't celebrate. He didn't need to. For him, the loss of the Whitmores was not victory. It was consequence. He had not acted to prove his power, but to protect his daughter's dignity. The world, however, saw in his choice a reminder of what respect, or the lack of it, could cost. By evening, commentators declared the Whitmore expansion effectively dead. Stock prices linked to their businesses tumbled. Rival families who had long envied their dominance quietly celebrated. And across the city, whispers grew louder. The Whitmores had fallen, not from a financial miscalculation, but from the weight of their own prejudice. The earthquake Marcus set in motion had only just begun. News of the collapse spread far beyond boardrooms and balance sheets. It wasn't just business media dissecting the numbers anymore. It was parents in kitchens, teachers in classrooms, and communities across the country sharing the story of two little girls who had been mocked in a room filled with people who should have known better. The incident at the Whitmore estate became a mirror, reflecting a truth that many had lived but few in power had ever been forced to confront. Racism does not disappear with money. It does not fade because of education or status or success. It finds its way into ballrooms and classrooms alike, into billion-dollar negotiations and playgrounds where children should only know joy. For Black families, the humiliation of Amara and Amina was painfully familiar. Mothers wrote on social media about the first time their daughters were told their braids were distracting at school. Fathers recounted stories of sons asked if they belonged in advanced classes, as though intelligence had a color. Each story carried the same undertone. Achievement never guaranteed acceptance. Commentators tried to soften it. Some insisted it was just a misunderstanding, that the Whitmores hadn't meant to wound. But the images people carried in their minds were not misunderstandings. They were echoes of their own experiences. The sound of laughter at a child's expense. The sting of being othered in spaces that preached inclusion but practiced exclusion. The truth was uncomfortable, but it needed to be said. Racism wasn't confined to overt insults shouted in the streets. It was present in polite chuckles at a dinner table, in the silence of adults who should have defended two little girls but chose their own comfort instead. It was in the way those with power felt entitled to mock, believing their wealth made their cruelty untouchable. Amara and Amina became symbols in that conversation, not because they asked to be, but because the nation saw their innocence violated in a way that resonated deeply. They were 9-year-old girls, taught to hold their heads high, yet forced to bow them beneath laughter. For every Black child who had sat in a classroom while classmates tugged at their braids or questioned their names, the story struck a nerve. Marcus's decision to pull out of the deal wasn't only a business move, it was a declaration. It said that dignity was not negotiable, that silence would not be bought for $500 million. And in that decision, people saw a possibility. What if every parent, every professional, every leader refused to stay silent when racism showed its face? What would that cost the systems that thrive on exclusion? Teachers began using the story in classrooms, asking students to reflect on kindness and respect. Community leaders referenced it in speeches, urging people not to confuse civility with justice. Even children old enough to understand followed the news, asking their parents, why would anyone laugh at girls just because of their hair? The answers were difficult, but necessary. Conversations bloomed across dinner tables, workplaces, and congregations. They weren't about the Whitmores alone. They were about a nation where two little girls could be mocked publicly, and most of the room would do nothing. Some pushed back, claiming Marcus had overreacted, that business should not be mixed with personal insult. But others countered with a sharper truth. How could business be separated from humanity? How could anyone expect a father to hand over $500 million to those who laughed at his children? The story became less about one family and more about a choice facing everyone. Stay silent or demand respect. It wasn't about the numbers on a balance sheet. It was about what those numbers stood for and what they could never replace. For Amara and Amina, the lessons of that night would take years to fully understand. But the world was already drawing its own lesson. Racism, even when dressed in gowns and tuxedos, remains racism. And silence, when chosen carefully, can speak louder than all the laughter in the world. The storm that rattled the Whitmores did not end in boardrooms or news cycles. It extended into living rooms, schools, and communities where parents and children replayed the story and asked the same question: how do we make sure this doesn't happen again? Marcus Thompson had always believed in building for the future, not only for his own family, but for others who shared their struggles. That belief hardened after the night of the fundraiser. Watching Amara and Amina walk into their school days later, shoulders squared yet eyes shadowed, convinced him that silence was no longer enough. The Whitmores' cruelty had exposed a deeper wound, and he intended to heal it, not only for his daughters, but for every child who carried the same scars. Within weeks, Marcus announced the launch of the Amara and Amina Foundation, a national initiative dedicated to empowering young Black girls through education, mentorship, and leadership programs. At the press conference, he did not mention the Whitmores by name. He didn't have to. His message was sharper without it. "My daughters were mocked for being who they are," he said, standing with Amara and Amina at his side. "No child should carry shame for their hair, their heritage, or the color of their skin. If others cannot see their worth, then we will build a world that does." The initiative quickly gained traction. Scholarships were offered to underrepresented students. Partnerships were formed with schools to provide safe spaces where young girls could learn without fear of ridicule. Mentors, women who had navigated careers in law, medicine, business, and the arts, stepped forward to guide the next generation. Amara and Amina watched it unfold with wide eyes. For them, the memory of laughter at the Whitmores' table was still raw, but it was being rewritten each day as letters poured in from girls across the country. One read, "I used to hide my braids, now I wear them proudly." Another said, "Your story made me feel less alone." Naomi, too, found healing in action. She began speaking at universities and conferences, sharing what it meant to raise daughters in a world that often sought to diminish them. She reminded audiences that racism didn't just happen in slurs or violence. It happened in whispers, chuckles, and silence. It happened when adults allowed cruelty to pass unchecked. The Thompsons' decision to respond not with rage but with resolve inspired many. Communities began holding workshops on bias in schools. Parents lobbied for changes to dress codes that unfairly targeted natural hairstyles. Teachers received training to recognize the subtle ways exclusion can shape a child's self-worth. Even in the corporate world, the fallout reached further. Companies began re-examining diversity policies, not out of charity, but out of necessity. Marcus's withdrawal from the Whitmore deal had demonstrated in real time how racism could dismantle fortunes. Respect was no longer a suggestion, it was a prerequisite. But for Marcus, the true measure of success was not in headlines or market reactions. It was in his daughters. One evening, as they sat together after dinner, Amara asked, "Daddy, why did they laugh at us?" Marcus paused, searching for words simple enough to hold the truth without breaking her heart. "Because sometimes people laugh when they don't understand," he said gently, "and sometimes they laugh to make themselves feel bigger. But their laughter doesn't define you, it defines them." Amina leaned against him, her braids brushing his arm. "So, we don't have to be smaller?" "Never," Marcus replied. "You were born to be seen. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Those words became the heartbeat of the Foundation's mission: to ensure no child ever felt they had to shrink to fit into someone else's idea of belonging. As months passed, the story of the Whitmores faded from front pages. Their failed expansion was just another cautionary tale in financial circles. But the story of Amara and Amina lived on, not as a tale of humiliation, but as a spark that lit change. Letters continued to arrive. Parents wrote to thank the Thompsons for giving them language to defend their children. Young women wrote to say they had found mentors through the foundation. Schools reported higher confidence among students who once felt invisible. The Whitmores had tried to reduce two little girls to ornaments. Instead, those same girls had become symbols of resilience. Marcus knew the fight was not over. Racism would not disappear with one lost deal or one foundation. But he also knew the tide had shifted. What was once silence had become a chorus. And that chorus was growing louder. The story of Marcus Thompson and his daughters spread far beyond the walls of business conferences and glossy magazines. It became a story people carried with them into their homes, workplaces, and schools. For many, it was not just news, it was recognition. It was the echo of their own unspoken memories finally being given a voice. Letters poured into the Amara and Amina Foundation. Some came handwritten, folded into envelopes carefully addressed by parents who had never written to a billionaire before. Others arrived through email and social media, their words raw and immediate. One mother wrote, "When my daughter was told her hair wasn't professional, I didn't know how to explain it to her. Your story gave me the strength to tell her that her hair is her crown, and no one gets to take that from her." A father shared, "I sat in a parent-teacher meeting and listened as they said my son was too energetic for advanced classes. I knew what they meant. Reading about what happened to your daughters reminded me I can't be silent anymore." Teenagers wrote too. A 15-year-old from Chicago confessed, I used to beg my mom to straighten my hair every week so no one would laugh at me. When I heard about Amara and Amina, I stopped hiding. I wore my braids the next day. Each message was a thread weaving into something larger, a reminder that what happened in one gilded room resonated across an entire nation. The foundation's offices were soon filled with walls of printed notes and drawings set by children. Crayon sketches showed little girls with beads in their braids standing tall beside captions like, "I'm proud of me." Teachers began assigning essays where students reflected on what dignity meant to them. In church halls and community centers, the story became a parable retold. Wealth without respect is empty. Even those far removed from the realities of racism found themselves reflecting. Journalists reported on corporate executives quietly reevaluating policies, asking whether they had overlooked the voices of employees who never felt safe enough to speak. Some leaders admitted privately that they saw themselves in the silent guests at the Whitmore's table, people who had sat by and said nothing. The discomfort was the point. For the Thompson family, the impact reached closer to home too. At Amara and Amina's school, parents who had once kept their distance now approached Naomi with apologies and support. Teachers who had treated the girls with polite detachment began making a genuine effort to protect them from subtle slights. The twins noticed the shift. Amara whispered to her sister one morning, "People are nicer now." Amina nodded but replied softly, "It's not just us, it's everyone who looks like us." On social media, hashtags bearing the twins' names trended for weeks. Families posted pictures of their children with natural hair, declaring pride and solidarity. Videos circulated of young girls reading letters to themselves in the mirror, affirming their worth. The Thompsons had never asked for the spotlight, yet Marcus understood its power. He had withdrawn $500 million from a deal, but the true ripple effect was measured in voices that had once been silent and were now speaking with courage. There were critics, of course. Some commentators sneered that Marcus had politicized business, that he had overreacted to harmless words. But their voices were drowned out by the louder, more urgent truth. Words are never harmless when aimed at a child's identity. Laughter at innocence is not humor. It is harm, and harm demands accountability. The impact was not temporary. Months later, when other high-profile stories of racism surfaced, people recalled the Thompsons. "Remember what happened to those twins?" became a shorthand, a reference point for why silence is no longer acceptable. Their names, once spoken only in whispers at a cruel dinner table, had become symbols of strength. For Marcus and Naomi, the greatest impact was not in headlines or hashtags, but in the quiet moments at home. They watched their daughters walk taller, speak louder, and smile wider when they realized the world had not broken them. The twins were learning early that pain can become purpose, and that dignity defended can echo far beyond a single night of humiliation. The Whitmores had measured their power in chandeliers and wine glasses, in diamonds and stock portfolios, in the arrogance of believing wealth gave them immunity from consequence. But the story they never expected to write was this one: the collapse of their empire, not because of numbers on a ledger, but because of laughter at two little girls who deserved dignity. The image of Amara and Amina sitting at that long table, their braids mocked, their innocence pierced by the cruelty of a room full of adults, lingered long after the contracts dissolved. It was an image that refused to fade, because it captured a truth so raw that no one could ignore it. Children are often the most honest mirrors of society's prejudice, and on that night, those mirrors reflected back a reality far too many had tried to deny: that racism does not vanish in polished rooms, it simply wears finer clothes. The Whitmores thought they had embarrassed Marcus Thompson and his family. They thought silence meant defeat, that by walking out quietly, he had accepted humiliation. But they misunderstood what silence can hold. Silence can carry fury. Silence can carry resolve. And sometimes silence carries the weight of an entire decision waiting to fall. Marcus's silence that night was not weakness, it was warning. And when he whispered, "Withdraw," every cent, the echo of those words traveled farther than any outburst could have. It traveled into banking halls, into stock markets, into the gilded chambers where the Whitmores once sat untouchable, and it dismantled everything they had built. The Whitmores thought they mocked two little girls. Instead, they mocked their own future. Marcus showed us all that dignity costs nothing, but disrespect can cost $500 million. And beyond the numbers, beyond the contracts and the headlines, what endured was something even more valuable. Amara and Amina, once seated in silence at that table, now stood as symbols of resilience. Their names were spoken in classrooms, in churches, in homes where parents told their children, "You are enough. Your worth is not for others to decide." The story became more than a scandal. It became a lesson written into the collective memory that arrogance built on prejudice will crumble, while dignity rooted in love will endure. For every person who had once remained silent in the face of cruelty, the story of the Thompsons became a challenge. What do we choose when we witness racism? Do we laugh along? Do we look away? Or do we stand, even if standing costs us something? The Whitmores answered with laughter. Marcus answered with consequence. The world decided which voice would carry further. And for the twins, the lesson was not only about cruelty, but about strength. They would remember the sting of that night, yes, but more importantly, they would remember the way their father's silence spoke louder than the Whitmores' laughter, the way their mother's steady hand reminded them they were not alone. With hope, the way the world shifted when one family refused to accept humiliation as the price of belonging. Poetic justice does not always arrive with fanfare. Sometimes it arrives with a simple truth. They laughed at twins, and the world laughed back at them. Now let's bring this home to you, watching right now. Have you ever witnessed children mocked for who they are? Maybe it was their hair, their clothes, the way they spoke, or simply the color of their skin. Have you ever stood in that silence, wishing you had spoken up? Or maybe you did speak, and your words gave someone else the strength to stand taller. I want to hear your story. Drop it in the comments below. Your voice matters, and your story could be the encouragement someone else needs tonight. And if this story moved you, if it reminded you that justice is not abstract, but something lived and fought for in moments like these, then make sure you subscribe to Echoes of Hope Stories HQ. This is where we tell the stories others try to bury. Stories that hurt, yes, but also stories that heal. Stories where justice echoes louder than hate. Because racism doesn't end in one fundraiser, one deal, or one act of humiliation. It ends when voices rise together. It ends when silence becomes action. And it ends when we refuse to let laughter at innocence go unchallenged. So subscribe, share, and keep the conversation alive.